The sun hammered the cracked earth of Blackwood. Heat rose in shimmering, violent waves from the main road, distorting the shapes of the dilapidated wooden storefronts until they looked like melting wax. A stray hound panted under the scant shade of a hitching post, its ribs pressing against thin fur with every labored breath. Fine, alkaline dust coated everything. The opaque windows of the assayer's office, the scuffed boots of the men slouching against the saloon wall, the dry, cracked lips of the townsfolk. Every plank of the boardwalk groaned under the stagnant weight of the afternoon. The air tasted of sulfur from the nearby mines and dried sweat. Men chewed on cheap bitter tobacco, spitting dark brown streams into the parched dirt, leaving small dark craters in the dust. Women in faded cotton dresses clutched woven baskets to their chests, their eyes narrowed to slits against the blinding glare. Conversation was a low, grating murmur, like the sound of millstones grinding grain into coarse flour. Then the murmur stopped. The silence fell over the street, heavy, sudden, and absolute. The only sound left was the rhythmic dragging scrape of worn leather soles against the loose gravel. She walked up the center of the road directly through the rising heat. Her dress, once a pale blue, was now stiff with layers of hardened dust and dark grease stains at the hem. A frayed woolen shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders, defying the suffocating temperature. She held a dented tin bucket in her right hand, her knuckles white and jutting out from the tight grip. As she passed the general store, the men leaning against the oak barrels shifted their weight. They didn't speak a single word. They simply turned their backs to her, forming a wall of denim and flannel. A woman sweeping the dust off her porch stopped mid-motion. She clutched the broom handle, her knuckles whitening, and took a deliberate, slow step backward into the deep shadows of her doorway. She pulled the door shut. The iron latch clicked with a sharp metallic snap that echoed down the empty street. Further down, a young boy let go of his mother's skirt and took a half step toward the street, his eyes wide. His mother's hand shot out her fingers, digging into the fabric of his shirt. She yanked him back with enough force to make him stumble, shielding his face with her apron, as if the girl walking past carried a plague in the air. The girl kept her head down. Her hair, tangled dark and brittle at the ends, shielded her profile. She focused entirely on the uneven dirt path ahead of her boots. The air around her seemed to thicken, choked by the collective burning stares drilling into her shoulders and spine. No one raised a hand to strike her. They didn't need to. The hostility was a physical crushing weight, pressing her down into the dirt. She reached the communal water pump sitting at the center of the dusty square. The iron handle was blistering hot under the afternoon sun. She set her bucket under the rusted spout and reached a trembling hand for the lever. A heavy steel-toed boot clamped down on the bucket's rim. The scrape of metal against gravel cut through the quiet square. The girl froze her hand, hovering mere inches from the pump handle. She didn't look up. She kept her gaze locked onto the scuffed brown leather of the boot, pinning her bucket to the ground. The boot belonged to Miller, the town blacksmith. He stood there, legs braced apart. His massive arms crossed over a barrel chest, slick with sweat and black soot. He chewed his tobacco slowly, the heavy muscles in his jaw rolling in a steady, menacing rhythm. He inhaled deeply, gathering a mouthful of saliva and bitter juice. He leaned forward, his shadow falling over her small frame, and spat. The dark liquid landed with a wet smack just inches from the tip of her worn shoe, splattering thick brown drops onto the hem of her dusty dress. Miller slowly lifted his boot and kicked the tin bucket. The metal clattered violently across the square, rolling and bouncing until it came to a stop near the dry watering trough. "Pump's dry," Miller said. His voice was a flat, low rumble, carrying no anger, only cold dismissal. The lie hung in the stagnant air, plain and unchallenged by anyone on the street. A single drop of fresh, clear water gathered at the lip of the iron spout, swelled and fell into the dirt, instantly absorbed by the parched earth. The girl lowered her hand. She stood motionless for a long moment, the relentless sun beating down on her back, heating the heavy wool shawl. She did not plead. She did not open her mouth to argue. The rise and fall of her chest remained slow, measured, and tightly controlled. She turned her movement stiff and mechanical and walked toward the trough. She bent down her knees, popping audibly in the quiet air, and picked up the dented bucket. The metal scraped against the dry earth. From the shaded porches, from behind grimy windows, and from the narrow alleys, the town watched. A low whisper rustled through the onlookers, a sound like dry leaves scraping across a tombstone. Cursed. The word wasn't shouted. It drifted on the hot wind, passed through clenched teeth from mouth to mouth. She walked back the way she came, her bucket empty, her shadow stretching long and thin ahead of her. The town remained perfectly silent until she crossed the invisible town line, her figure slowly disappearing into the shimmering heat distortion of the open trail. Only when she was completely out of sight did the men resume their chewing. The women reopened their doors, and the grating, relentless murmur of Blackwood began again. The rhythmic strike of iron-shod hooves against baked earth broke the desert's vast, suffocating quiet. A solitary rider materialized from the shimmering heat haze on the southern trail. The horse, a massive roan with a coat dull from dried sweat and alkali dust, moved with a slow, deliberate plod. Each step kicked up a small cloud of white powder that clung to the animal's fetlocks. The saddle leather cracked and groaned, a dry, rhythmic counterpoint to the steady, heavy impact of the hooves. The man in the saddle sat perfectly still, absorbing the jolts of the uneven trail. A wide-brimmed Stetson, its original color lost to years of sun rain and grit, was pulled low over his brow. A bandana stiff with dirt covered his lower face against the choking dust. His shoulders were broad, draped in a heavy canvas duster that hung rigidly around his frame, the hem sweeping against the tops of his worn leather boots. A pair of silver spurs, tarnished black and missing rowels, clinked softly with a dull, muted chime. His hands, wrapped in cracked leather gloves, rested loosely on the saddle horn. They held the reins with a grip that was relaxed, yet entirely absolute. Just below his right thigh, the polished wood grip of a heavy-caliber revolver protruded from a scuffed leather holster. The leather thong securing the hammer was unfastened. As the roan crested the slight incline leading into Blackwood, the rider pulled back on the reins. The horse halted, blowing a long, wet snort through flared nostrils, its massive ribcage expanding and contracting. The town sprawled before them, a collection of rotting wood and peeling paint baking under the merciless sun. The air here was thicker, carrying the distinct sour stench of unwashed bodies, stale beer and sulfur from the distant mines. The rider reached up with a gloved hand and pulled the bandana down around his neck. His jaw was covered in a thick graying scruff. His lips were chapped, split deeply at the center. He nudged the roan forward. The entrance to Blackwood was marked by the skeletal remains of a burnt-out livery stable. As the horse's hooves struck the first wooden planks of the main street, the low murmur of the town faltered. Eyes shifted from beneath the brims of cheap hats. Faces pressed against the smudged glass of the assayer's office. The rider did not turn his head to meet their gazes. He kept his eyes fixed dead ahead, scanning the geometry of the street, the shadows between the buildings, the empty rooftops. Up ahead, at the edge of the town limits, the girl in the frayed wool shawl was making her slow retreat. Her head remained bowed, the empty tin bucket swinging listlessly against her thigh. On the elevated boardwalk to her right, outside the feed and seed store, a man leaned heavily against a wooden support pillar. He wore suspenders over a stained, collarless shirt. A wooden bucket sat at his feet, brimming with dark, foul-smelling water left over from swabbing the store's floorboards. Gray suds floated on the surface, thick with grime horsehair and tobacco spit. The man watched the girl approach. He casually hooked a boot around the base of the wooden bucket. The rider 20 yards away pulled his horse to a slow walk. The creak of his saddle seemed to magnify in the oppressive silence. The girl drew parallel to the feed store. The man on the boardwalk kicked the bucket forward. He didn't just tip it. He angled it sharply with the steel toe of his boot. A thick wave of gray slop vaulted over the edge of the boardwalk. It struck the girl squarely on her shins and splashed violently across the dry, cracked earth. The foul liquid soaked instantly into her heavy skirts, pasting the thick wool to her legs. The stench of rotting lye and mud rose into the hot air. The girl stopped. Her shoulders flinched upward, a sharp, involuntary contraction. She stood motionless in the spreading puddle of dark mud. The empty tin bucket in her hand scraped lightly against her leg as her grip tightened, the knuckles pressing white against the thin skin. She did not look up at the man on the boardwalk. She simply stood there, dirty water dripping from her hem, pooling around the worn leather of her boots. The man in the suspenders let out a low, raspy chuckle. He hooked his thumbs into his pockets, his jaw rolling as he chewed his tobacco. Then, a tall shadow fell across the sun-baked dirt in front of him. The roan horse stopped in the center of the road, placing its massive bulk squarely between the girl and the boardwalk. The beast let out a low rumbling breath, its head lowering as it inspected the dark puddle of water. The man on the boardwalk stopped chuckling. His eyes traveled up the long, dusty legs of the horse, past the saddlebags, and stopped at the rider. The cowboy sat in the saddle perfectly still. His hands remained draped casually over the saddle horn. He didn't speak. He didn't adjust his hat. He simply looked down at the man in the suspenders. Beneath the brim of the Stetson, his eyes were pools of flat, cold slate. There was no heat in them. They were completely devoid of warmth, like the eyes of a wolf watching a wounded calf. The stare was heavy, carrying the weight of a physical blow. The silence settled over the street, thick and suffocating. The heat beat down on them, relentless. A single drop of sweat broke out on the store owner's forehead, tracing a pale line down his grimy cheek, cutting through a layer of dust. He unhooked his thumbs from his pockets and let his arms hang uselessly at his sides. He took a half step back, his boot heel catching loudly on a warped floorboard. The cowboy held the gaze for 3 long, deliberate seconds. Then, very slowly, his right hand shifted. The thick leather glove slid off the saddle horn and came to rest on his thigh. The tips of his fingers brushed lightly against the worn wood of the revolver's grip. The store owner swallowed hard. The sound was a dry click in the quiet street. He turned, his movements jerky and uncoordinated, and retreated into the dark interior of his store, pulling the heavy wooden door shut behind him. The cowboy did not look back at the girl. He gently dug his heels into the roan's flanks. The horse snorted and stepped forward, its hooves crunching heavily into the gravel, carrying the rider deeper into the heart of Blackwood. Behind him, the girl resumed her slow, dragging walk into the vast expanse of the open desert, her soaked skirts leaving a trail of dark, heavy drops in the white dust. The batwing doors of the Silver Vein Saloon groaned on rusted iron hinges, pushing a wave of stagnant, heavy air out into the street. Inside, the heat functioned as a physical weight trapped beneath a low, smoke-stained ceiling of rotting pine. The room tasted of spilled rye whiskey, unwashed canvas, and the sharp, stinging tang of ammonia rising from the damp sawdust, coating the floorboards. Fat black horseflies buzzed in lazy, erratic circles around sticky oil lanterns, swaying slightly from the crossbeams. In the far corner, a weathered upright piano sat silent, its ivory keys chipped and yellowed like old teeth. Men sat hunched over scarred wooden tables, their shoulders slumped under the oppressive afternoon temperature. Damp patches of sweat stained the backs of their flannel shirts. Decks of greasy cards slapped against wood in a sluggish rhythm. The clinking of cheap glass and the hollow thud of boots punctuated the low, gravelly hum of voices. Then the batwing doors parted. The leather hinges squealed a high-pitched, agonizing scrape that cut through the thick atmosphere of the room. The cowboy stepped inside. The floorboards, warped from decades of spilled liquor and shifting foundations, bowed under his boots. The dull, heavy drag of his spurs echoed in the sudden, absolute quiet. Conversations died in dry throats. A man rolling a cigarette stopped, the thin white paper pinched between his thumb and forefinger, tobacco flakes drifting down onto the table. Eyes bloodshot and shadowed by wide brims shifted toward the tall, dust-coated figure silhouetted against the blinding glare of the doorway. He walked the length of the room. His canvas duster swept against the backs of empty chairs, kicking up small clouds of sawdust. He did not look left or right. His gaze remained leveled straight ahead, fixed on the polished mahogany of the bar. He stopped at the counter. The surface was deeply gouged, bearing the jagged scars of hunting knives and the dark burn marks of forgotten cigars. The bartender, a heavy-set man with a stained rag thrown over one meaty shoulder, stopped wiping a glass. A bead of sweat traced the deep crease beside his nose, hanging from his chin for a second, before dropping onto the soiled collar of his shirt. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing sharply against his thick neck. The cowboy raised 2 fingers. He kept his jaw locked. He did not utter a single syllable. The bartender gave a quick, jerky nod. He reached under the counter, retrieving a battered tin pot resting on a small iron wood stove. He poured the dark liquid into a thick, chipped ceramic mug. The coffee was black, sludgy, and poured with the consistency of crude oil. Steam curled lazily from the surface, carrying the acrid, burnt scent of roasted chicory. He slid the mug across the scarred wood. To the cowboy's immediate left, 3 men occupied a round table situated near the clouded, grime-covered front window. They wore the heavy dust of the trail, but their holsters rode high on their hips, the leather tie-downs securely fastened to their thighs. The man in the center, sporting a jagged white scar across his jawline, leaned forward. He spun a half-empty whiskey glass between his calloused fingers. The heavy bottom of the glass scraped roughly against the tabletop, a grating sound in the quiet saloon. "Saw Miller give her a wash today," the scarred man muttered. His voice was a rasping scrape like a rusted shovel blade hitting buried rock. "Mud and lye water. Stood there taking it. Dumb animal." The man beside him, chewing a thick wad of black tobacco, spat a dark stream into a brass spittoon at his feet. It rang with a dull, wet ping. "Town's had enough of the rot. Sun goes down, we ride out to the ridge. Needs a proper cleansing." "She won't put up a fight," the third man added, leaning back in his chair, the wood creaking under his weight. "Just lock the timber door from the outside. Throw a lantern through the window. Let the embers do the talking. The curse burns out tonight. Ashes to ashes." They clinked their glasses together. The sharp, brittle sound fractured the heavy silence of the room. The cowboy lifted his chipped mug. He drank the boiling, bitter sludge in slow, measured swallows. The muscles in his throat worked rhythmically beneath his graying scruff. He did not turn his head toward the table. His slate-gray eyes remained fixed on the cracked, tarnished mirror behind the bar, watching the distorted reflections of the three men. He finished the coffee. He set the empty mug down. It hit the mahogany with a heavy, hollow thud. He reached into the deep pocket of his canvas duster. The sound of shifting stiff fabric immediately drew the scarred man's attention. The thug stopped spinning his glass. His right hand drifted slowly, casually toward the staghorn grip of his revolver. The entire saloon held its breath. The buzzing of a single fly against the clouded window pane sounded like a spinning saw blade. The cowboy pulled a solid silver dollar from his pocket. It was heavy, its edges tarnished black from years of handling. He held it between his thick leather gloves, the metal catching the dim yellowish light of the lantern above. He turned his head slowly, his eyes locked onto the scarred man. The thug's jaw tightened, the white scar stretching taut across his skin. The cowboy didn't take a single step toward them. He simply raised his hand and flicked his thumb. The heavy silver coin snapped through the hot air, a silver blur of spinning metal. It struck the scarred man's whiskey glass dead center. The impact cracked like a whip. The thin, cheap glass shattered instantly. Jagged shards sprayed violently across the scarred wood. Amber liquor exploded outward, soaking the front of the thug's shirt, dripping rapidly down the edge of the table, and pooling into the sawdust. The heavy silver dollar spun rapidly on the wet wood, producing a high metallic whine that slowly lost momentum, finally rattling to a dead-heavy stop amidst the broken glass. The scarred man froze. His hand hovered rigidly over his holster. A small, jagged piece of glass embedded itself in his knuckle. A single drop of dark blood welled up, mixing with the spilled whiskey on his skin. He stared at the silver coin, his chest rising and falling in quick, shallow breaths before slowly raising his eyes. The cowboy was already turning away. He adjusted the brim of his Stetson, pulling it an inch lower against the glare, and walked toward the batwing doors. The heavy boots dragged across the floorboards. He pushed through the swinging doors, disappearing back into the blinding white heat of the street, leaving the thick, sour scent of spilled whiskey and a suffocating, unbroken silence in his wake. The late afternoon sun sank toward the jagged teeth of the western ridge, bleeding a harsh copper light across the salt flats. The heat lost its blinding edge, settling into a heavy, suffocating warmth that baked the earth. The roan horse navigated the dry, cracked bed of a forgotten creek, its iron shoes scraping against smooth river stones. White dust plumed around the animal's fetlocks with every heavy step. The town of Blackwood faded into a cluster of gray splinters in the rearview distance. Ahead lay nothing but miles of brittle sagebrush, twisted Joshua trees, and the punishing expanse of the open desert. A solitary structure broke the flat, desolate horizon. It was barely a cabin. Weather-beaten pine boards, stripped of paint and bleached gray by decades of relentless sun, leaned precariously against each other. The tin roof was a patchwork of rust and crude iron patches. A single stone chimney stood off-center, crumbling at the mortar. Surrounding the perimeter was the skeletal remain of a wooden fence. Most of the posts were violently uprooted, lying flat in the dirt. The crossbeams were splintered, snapped in half like dry twigs, leaving the property entirely exposed to the vast emptiness. The cowboy pulled back on the reins. The roan snorted, tossing its heavy head, and came to a halt near a skeletal mesquite tree. The leather saddle groaned as the man shifted his weight and swung his long legs over the side. His boots hit the packed dirt with a dull thud. A small cloud of dust rose and settled over his spurs. He looped the thick leather reins over a low gnarled branch. He did not look toward the shack. He unbuckled his canvas duster, letting the heavy fabric fall open. exposing the worn flannel shirt underneath. He walked toward the perimeter. He stopped at the first downed fence post. The wood was bone dry and the edges jagged and raw where it had been splintered by heavy boots. Half buried in the alkaline dirt beside the post lay a rusted iron hammer and a leather pouch spilling bent, oxidized nails. The cowboy slowly reached up and gripped the fingers of his right leather glove. He pulled it off, revealing a hand mapped with pale scars, deep calluses, and dirt ground permanently into the knuckles. He tucked the glove into his belt. He did the same with the left. He bent down. His knees popped in the quiet air. He wrapped his bare hand around the wooden handle of the hammer. The wood was coarse, dried out, and familiar. He picked it up, weighing the heavy iron head in his palm. Inside the shack, the air was stagnant and thick with the smell of dried herbs and old wool. The single room was cast in deep shadows. A sliver of copper light pierced through a jagged crack in the opaque, grease-stained window pane. The girl stood perfectly still in the center of the room. The damp hem of her dress clung heavily to her calves. She held her breath. Her eyes were locked onto the narrow beam of light illuminating dust motes dancing in the dead air. Through the cracked glass, she watched the tall figure in the faded Stetson. She watched him lift the heavy splintered crossbeam of the fence. The muscles in his forearms pulled taut against the skin. He aligned the broken wood against the upright post. He retrieved a bent nail from the dirt. He placed the sharp tip against the wood. He swung the hammer. The iron struck the nail head. The metallic crack fractured the immense silence of the desert. It was a sharp, concussive sound that echoed off the distant canyon walls. Inside the cabin, the girl's shoulders flinched at the impact. Her fingers curled inward, gripping the rough fabric of her skirt. She did not retreat. She remained anchored to the floorboards, her gaze fixed on the sliver of glass. Outside, the cowboy drew the hammer back again. He swung. The nail drove deeper into the dry pine. He swung a third time, sinking the iron head flush with the wood. He moved to the next post. He dug his boots into the gravel, using his entire body weight to heave the heavy timber upright. He packed loose rocks and hard dirt around the base, stomping it down with his heel until the post stood rigid against the wind. He found another nail. He raised the hammer. The rhythm established itself. A heavy, methodical strike. A pause. Another strike. The sound was relentless, echoing a steady heartbeat across the barren landscape. The cowboy did not pause to wipe the sweat gathering at his brow. He did not glance toward the shack. He moved from post to post, lifting the fallen timber, driving the rusted iron into the wood, slowly rebuilding the physical boundary between the fragile cabin and the open wasteland. The copper light of the sun deepened into a dark, bruised crimson. Shadows stretched long and thin across the salt flats. The temperature began its rapid plunge, replacing the suffocating heat with the biting chill of the desert evening. Through the cracked pane of glass, the girl watched the silhouette of the man against the dying light. The rhythmic pounding of the hammer continued a steady physical defiance against the quiet desolation. She slowly let out the breath she had been holding. Her hand relaxed its grip on her skirt. She took a single silent step closer to the window. The copper sun bled out behind the western ridge, leaving a bruised violet sky stretched tight over the salt flats. The temperature plummeted. The desert exhaled its stored heat, replacing the suffocating air with a biting, dry chill that bit through coarse fabric. The rhythmic crack of iron against pine had become a steady, unrelenting pulse in the vast emptiness. The cowboy stood at the final corner of the perimeter. His breathing was slow and measured white vapor pluming faintly from his nostrils with every exhalation. He drove another rusted nail through a heavy crossbeam, sinking the iron head flush with the splintered wood. The crunch of wooden carriage wheels rolling over loose gravel broke the rhythm. A black lacquered buggy emerged from the twilight, drawn by a sleek, well-fed Morgan horse. The animal's coat possessed a glossy sheen, a stark, jarring contrast to the bone-dry landscape and the cowboy's dust-caked roan. The buggy halted 10 yards from the freshly erected fence line. A man stepped down. He wore a heavy wool coat over a starched white collar. A silver pocket watch chain draped across a pristine black vest. The faint, sweet scent of bay rum cologne drifted on the evening wind, cutting through the raw smell of turned earth and dry sage. Reverend Cale did not bother dusting the chalky dirt from his polished leather boots. He gripped a silver-tipped walking cane, leaning his weight onto it as he approached the boundary. He stopped just short of the mended fence. He did not look at the cowboy. He directed his gaze over the wooden beams, fixing his eyes on the dark, silent shack. "The sun is set, child," Cale projected. His voice was a rich, practiced baritone, rolling across the dry yard with theatrical weight. And with the fading light, so fades the tolerance of decent men. The cowboy reached into his leather pouch. His calloused fingers scraped against the bottom. He pulled out a bent, oxidized nail. He positioned it against the timber. Crack. The hammer struck the iron. The Morgan horse twitched its ears, shifting its hooves uncomfortably in the dirt. Cale's jaw tightened, but he kept his eyes locked on the shack. A shepherd cannot allow a diseased sheep to mingle with the flock. Cale continued, his tone rising, taking on the cadence of a Sunday pulpit. "Your presence here is a blight, a rot that infects the soil of Blackwood. We have suffered your shadow for too long. The Lord demands purity. Tonight the congregation gathers. The fire will cleanse this stain." The cowboy rotated the hammer in his grip. He found a straight nail. He tapped it lightly into the wood to set the point. Crack. The blow drove the nail deep. The sharp echo rang off the distant canyon walls. Cale's knuckles turned white around the silver handle of his cane. He finally turned his head, his gaze shifting to the tall figure in the faded duster. "You waste your labor, drifter," Cale said. The theatrical warmth vanished from his voice, replaced by a flat, abrasive edge. "That timber will not stand the night. It will burn. And so will anyone foolish enough to stand behind it." The cowboy did not pause. He did not look up. He reached for another nail. Cale took a step forward, bringing the tip of his silver cane up, pointing it directly at the cowboy's broad back. "I am speaking to you, vagrant. You are interfering with righteous work. Pack your saddle, mount your beast. You ride out now, and you might keep your skin intact. We suffer no strangers in our judgment." The cowboy stopped. He stood perfectly still, his back to the preacher. The wind picked up, rustling the heavy canvas of his duster. He slowly lowered his left hand, letting it rest at his side. In his right hand, he held the heavy iron hammer. He turned. His movements were smooth, deliberate, and entirely devoid of urgency. He looked at Cale. Beneath the brim of the Stetson, his slate-gray eyes caught the dying light. They were flat, empty. Cale opened his mouth to speak again, his chest puffing out beneath the black vest. The cowboy shifted his weight. His right arm snapped forward in a violent, fluid blur. He did not swing the hammer. He threw it. The heavy block of rusted iron and worn hickory whistled through the cold air. It crossed the distance between them in a fraction of a second. The hammerhead slammed into the thick wooden post of the buggy's frame, a mere 2 inches from Reverend Cale's right ear. The concussive impact sounded like a gunshot. A spray of sharp pine splinters exploded outwards, dusting the shoulder of Cale's immaculate wool coat. The wooden handle of the hammer vibrated violently, emitting a low, menacing hum against the polished wood of the carriage. Cale froze. His mouth remained slightly open. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin the color of old parchment. He did not breathe. A single bead of sweat broke from his hairline, tracing a slow path down his temple, cutting a clean line through the faint layer of trail dust on his cheek. The silver-tipped cane in his hand trembled. The cowboy walked forward. His boots crunched heavily against the gravel. He closed the distance, stopping mere inches from the preacher. He reached out with a scarred bare hand and gripped the vibrating hickory handle. He planted his boot against the carriage wheel and yanked the hammer free with a harsh, splintering tear. He looked down at the preacher. "Sermon's over." His voice was a low, gravelly rasp, barely louder than the wind dragging across the sagebrush. Cale swallowed heavily. The sound was a loud, dry click in his throat. He lowered his cane, his movements stiff and uncoordinated. He took a hasty step back, his heel catching on the hem of his heavy coat. He scrambled up onto the leather seat of the buggy, his hands fumbling wildly for the reins. He cracked the leather straps across the Morgan's back. The horse let out a startled whinny, surging forward. The buggy wheels spun in the loose dirt before tearing away down the dark trail toward the distant glow of Blackwood. The cowboy watched the dust settle. He slid the hammer through a worn loop on his gun belt. He turned his back to the road and walked slowly toward the dark, silent shack. The bruised violet sky hardened into an unforgiving ink-black canopy. The desert surrendered its last trace of warmth. A brittle, piercing cold swept across the salt flats, turning the scattered sagebrush into rigid skeletal claws. Miles away at the edge of the visible world, the horizon began to bleed. It was not the sun. It was a jagged pulsing line of crude orange light. Blackwood was igniting. The wind shifted, carrying the faint, unmistakable stench of kerosene burning pitch and raw sulfur. It brought the lowest registers of sound, the muffled rhythmic thud of heavy boots on wooden boardwalks, the chaotic clatter of tack and harnesses, the strike of iron hooves on packed dirt. It was the mechanical, deliberate orchestration of a mob. They were saddling up. At the edge of the desolation, the repaired fence line stood as a fragile barricade against the vast darkness. Inside the perimeter, the cowboy sat on a sawed-off stump of petrified wood. He had forbidden a fire. The shack remained a lightless void indistinguishable from the surrounding night. He sat motionless, a dense shadow against the warped siding of the cabin. His heavy canvas duster was pulled tight, the collar turned up against the biting wind. The brim of his Stetson obscured his eyes. He breathed in a slow rhythmic cadence, his lungs drawing in the freezing air, his nostrils flaring slightly at the scent of distant wood smoke. Nearby, the roan horse shifted its immense weight, its iron shoes grinding into the gravel. The animal let out a low, nervous blow, smelling the approaching violence. The heavy timber door of the shack groaned. The rusted iron hinges emitted a long, agonizing scrape that severed the quiet. A narrow sliver of absolute blackness opened in the doorway. The girl stepped out onto the porch. She had discarded the heavy ruined shawl. She wore only the faded cotton dress, the hem snapping violently in the wind. Her bare feet made no sound against the splintered floorboards. In her hands she cradled a hollowed-out gourd fashioned into a dipper. Water sloshed heavily against the dry, curved rim. She descended the single wooden step. The cold bit into her exposed skin, raising goosebumps along her pale arms, but she did not shiver. Her movements were slow, measured, and hyper-aware of the dark figure sitting 10 feet away. She closed the distance. She stopped. The wind howled through the gaps in the newly erected fence. She extended her arms, offering the water. The cowboy did not shift his gaze from the glowing horizon immediately. The silence stretched heavy and expectant. Finally, he turned his head. He reached out. His thick, leather-gloved hand wrapped around the smooth-worn handle of the gourd. His gloved thumb brushed the rough edge of the rim. He took the weight of the water. She released her grip. She took a deliberate half-step backward, crossing her arms tightly over her chest. He lifted the gourd. The water was freezing, carrying the sharp metallic taste of deep aquifer iron and clay. He drank it down in 3 long, deliberate swallows. His throat worked against the cold liquid. When he finished, he lowered the dipper. He extended his arm back toward her. She took it. Their eyes did not meet in the dark. She turned her bare feet, retreating across the dirt and up the wooden step. She slipped back behind the heavy door. The iron latch fell into place with a dull, heavy clunk. The cowboy turned his face back to the wind. The orange stain on the horizon was spreading, creeping outward like a grease fire on a dry rag. He reached down to his right thigh. He unfastened the leather thongs securing the hammer of his revolver. The stiff leather squeaked faintly. He wrapped his hand around the polished walnut grip and drew the weapon. The heavy blued steel absorbed the ambient starlight, a dark void in his hands. He pressed the release latch with his thumb. He snapped his wrist sideways. The cylinder swung out with a sharp, heavy clack. He tilted the barrel skyward. 6 heavy brass cartridges slid from the chambers, dropping into his waiting palm. The metal was freezing. He reached into his duster pocket and retrieved a small grease-stained rag. He wiped down the cylinder, the smell of burnt powder and sharp gun oil rising into the cold air. He wiped the barrel, his thumb tracing the worn edge of the front sight. He picked up the cartridges from his lap. He inspected each one by feel in the dark, his thumb sliding over the flat, unspent primers. He fed them back into the cylinder. The brass scraped against the steel chambers with a distinct metallic hiss. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. He flicked his wrist again. The loaded cylinder snapped shut, locking into the frame with a resonant concussive thud that vibrated through the metal. He pulled the hammer back with his thumb, stopping at the half-cock notch. He rested the gun on his knee and ran his left hand over the cylinder, giving it a sharp spin. Click-clack, click-clack, click. The rapid mechanical ratcheting cut through the howling wind. It was precise, cold, final. He let the cylinder lock tight. He rested his finger along the outside of the trigger guard. He pulled the collar of his duster tighter against the biting chill, set his jaw, and watched the wolves begin their march across the burning horizon. The main body of the mob remained a mile out, their torches forming a jagged bleeding wound against the ink-black night. But the vanguard always moved ahead of the fire. They came on foot, leaving their horses tethered in a dry wash, a quarter-mile back to mute their approach. 3 men. They navigated the brittle sagebrush with the heavy, uncoordinated steps of blunt instruments, their boots snapping dry twigs and shifting loose gravel in the dark. The cowboy knelt in the absolute blackness beside the rain barrel. He breathed strictly through his nose, drawing the freezing air deep into his lungs, letting it out in slow, controlled measures to prevent vapor clouds. The sharp synthetic tang of unwashed wool, stale chewing tobacco, and raw kerosene drifted on the shifting wind, announcing them before their shadows even broke the perimeter. Inside the shack, the girl sat on the floorboards, her knees pulled tight to her chest. She stared at the sliver of space beneath the heavy timber door. The cold drafted through the cracks. She heard the distinct heavy crunch of a boot stepping onto the gravel yard. The first man reached the newly repaired fence line. He carried a heavy iron pry bar, the metal clanking softly against the brass buckle of his gun belt. He paused, squinting into the pitch-black void of the yard. He raised the bar, wedging the flattened, rusted end between the upright post and the crossbeam. He leaned his shoulder into the wood, preparing to heave. A thick, leather-gloved hand materialized from the empty air behind him. It clamped violently over the man's mouth and nose, the stiff leather sealing his airway shut in a second. The cowboy pivoted on his heel, driving his knee squarely into the back of the man's thigh. The leg muscle buckled instantly. The cowboy dragged the collapsing weight backward, wrapping his left forearm under the jawline, locking in a suffocating choke. There was no shout. The struggle was a violent, muted thrashing in the dirt. Heavy boots kicked out, scraping deep gouges into the hard pan. The cowboy anchored his stance, bearing down with the dense leverage of his entire torso. The man's hands clawed frantically at the leather glove, ripping off a thumbnail against a heavy waxed seam. The violent jerk slowed. The thrashing dissolved into a heavy rhythmic shudder and then total heavy slack. The cowboy lowered the limp body to the freezing earth. He caught the falling iron pry bar with his boot, guiding it down to the sand without a single metallic clink. 10 yards away, near the corner of the front porch, the second man stopped. He carried a glass jug sloshing heavily with kerosene in his left hand, and a fistful of sulfur matches in his right. He turned his head, straining his ears against the wind. The heavy silence of the desert pressed back. "Boil!" he hissed. The word barely left his cracked lips, lost in a gust of freezing air. The dark shape beside the rain barrel detached itself from the wall. The man spun, dropping the matches into the dirt. His right hand darted to his boot sheath, ripping free a wide-bladed skinning knife. He lunged forward, thrusting the steel low, aiming for the gut. The cowboy did not step back. He stepped inside the arc of the blade. He brought his left forearm down in a brutal descending chop, striking the man's wrist just below the joint. The bone gave way with a wet, heavy snap. The knife slipped from the paralyzed fingers, tumbling harmlessly into the dust. Before the man could draw breath, the cowboy drove the heel of his right boot into the side of the man's kneecap. The joint inverted with a sickening pop. The man pitched forward, his jaw slamming directly into the splintered edge of the wooden porch step. He crumpled into a tight heap air, wheezing out of his lungs in a long, ragged hiss. The cowboy casually kicked the dropped knife deep under the floorboards. The third man stood 20 feet back, frozen near the skeletal mesquite tree. He held a lever-action Winchester rifle, the barrel trembling slightly. He stared at the dark shapes writhing on the ground, his chest heaving against his heavy coat. He raised the wooden stock to his shoulder, his thumb fumbling blindly for the hammer in the dark. The cold, hollow click of a revolver hammer locking into place echoed mere inches from his right ear. The man stopped breathing entirely. The rifle hung suspended in his rigid grip. The metallic scent of gun oil mixed with the freezing heat radiating from the cowboy's heavy canvas duster enveloped him. "Drop it." The voice was a gravelly scrape, barely a vibration in the dark. The man opened his fingers. The Winchester fell, the heavy wooden stock thudding dully into the soft sand. The cowboy swung the heavy barrel of his Colt. The solid blued steel connected flush with the base of the man's skull. The impact was a dense, heavy thud, like an axe handle striking wet wood. The man's knees gave out, and he collapsed forward, face-planting into the alkaline dirt. The cowboy stood alone over the 3 prone bodies. The wind howled, whipping the hem of his duster against his calves. He smoothly lowered the hammer of his revolver, with his thumb sliding the weapon back into the greased leather holster on his thigh. He bent down, grabbed the third man by the heavy collar of his coat, and began dragging the dead weight toward the shadow of the trough, clearing the killing floor for the fire that was coming. The ink-black night dissolved slowly into a bruised slate-gray dawn. The biting wind died down, leaving a stagnant, bone-chilling frost layered over the salt flats. The jagged, rotting skyline of Blackwood materialized against the eastern horizon, a dark smudge beneath a sky the color of old iron. A thin, sickly column of gray smoke rose from the town square, the remnants of the extinguished torches from the night before. At the perimeter of the shack, the cowboy remained seated on the petrified stump. A fine layer of white frost coated the broad shoulders of his canvas duster and the brim of his Stetson. He had not slept. He had not moved, save to drag the three unconscious scouts to the dry watering trough, binding their wrists and ankles tight with coarse braided hemp rope. They lay in the dirt, groaning softly through cracked lips as the freezing morning air gnawed at their limbs. The rhythmic, slow thud of hooves broke the immense quiet. A single rider approached from the town trail. He did not attempt to mask his approach. He rode a sway-backed, piebald mare, moving at a measured, non-threatening walk. The rider wore a heavy, moth-eaten buffalo hide coat that swallowed his thin frame. Pinned to the left breast of the coat, catching the dull, flat light of the morning, was a six-pointed tin star. It was heavily tarnished, the points rounded and dull from years of rubbing against wool and leather. Sheriff Tillman pulled the mare to a halt 10 yards from the freshly repaired fence line. He looked down at the three bound men shivering by the trough. He exhaled a thick plume of white vapor escaping his yellowed gray mustache. He dismounted stiffly. His knees popped audibly in the freezing air, and he leaned heavily against the mare's saddle for a long moment, waiting for his joints to bear his weight. He walked toward the fence. He did not rest his hands near the worn leather of his gun belt. He kept them visible, his bare liver-spotted fingers gripping the leather reins. "Those boys," Tillman said. His voice was a raspy, wet wheeze, ravaged by decades of cheap cigars and desert dust. He nodded toward the trough. "They belonged to Miller. He sent the hounds out to do the dirty work in the dark, hoping the town could wake up to clean ashes." The cowboy did not look up. He sat with his elbows resting on his knees. In his lap he held his heavy Colt revolver. He pressed his thumb against the loading gate, swinging it open with a sharp metallic click. Tillman cleared his throat. The sound was dry and grating like a shovel scraping stone. "Miller is rallying the square right now. Daylight gives them the courage the night stole. They are handing out the whiskey and breaking open the ammunition crates. They'll be here when the sun hits its peak. 50 men, maybe more. Shotguns, repeaters, and a whole lot of blind, stupid anger." The cowboy rotated the cylinder of the Colt. He did not look at the weapon. His hands operated purely on deep ingrained muscle memory. Click, click, click. The sound of the ratcheting steel was perfectly paced, completely steady. He checked the primer of each brass cartridge by touch. Tillman shifted his weight. His boot heels crunched loudly on the frost-heaved gravel. "I wear the badge," the old man muttered, his gaze dropping to the dirt. "But I don't own that town. Never did. I just signed the papers and keep the drunks from shooting the piano player. I'm riding out to the county seat this morning, taking the long trail. Won't be back for 3 days. What happens here? It ain't in my jurisdiction by the time I cross the ridge." The cowboy finished his rotation. He snapped the loading gate shut. The solid thud of the steel resonated in the cold air. Tillman looked up, his faded blue eyes watery against the chill. He stared at the silent, dark shack behind the cowboy. "Saddle your roan. Put the girl on the back. Ride west into the flats. You got a 4-hour head start. There is no water out there, but it's better than what's coming down that road. Don't die for a patch of dead dirt. Don't die for a town's bad conscience." The cowboy raised his head. The brim of the Stetson lifted just enough to reveal the slate-gray eyes. They locked onto the sheriff's face. The gaze was heavy, absolute, and entirely devoid of fear. The cowboy slowly holstered the heavy revolver. As his hand moved away from the leather, his thumb brushed unconsciously over the back of his left hand. Embedded deep in the scarred, calloused skin was a faded star-shaped burn mark, the exact size and shape of a marshal's badge branded into the flesh. Long ago, a permanent ghost of a past life built on authorized violence. He rested his forearms on his thighs. "County seat is east," the cowboy rasped. His voice was a low rumble, blending with the shifting wind. "You'd better start riding." But Tillman held the gaze for 3 long seconds. The old lawman's shoulders slumped further under the heavy hide coat. He gave a slow, barely perceptible nod. He turned his back, shuffling stiffly toward his piebald mare. He mounted the horse with a heavy grunt, turned the animal around, and spurred it into a slow trot back toward the rotting buildings of Blackwood, leaving the lone figure to wait for the rising sun. The sun crawled to the absolute apex of the bleached sky, hammering the salt flats with a suffocating white-hot glare. The morning frost had long since burned away, leaving the hardpan cracked and baking. Shadows shrank until they were nothing but tight, dark puddles directly beneath the hitching posts and the skeletal mesquite tree. The air grew stagnant heavy with the scent of dried sage and the metallic tang of heated iron. A low, sustained rumble vibrated through the soles of the cowboy's boots. It was a physical tremor long before it became a sound. A massive wall of alkaline dust choked the eastern horizon, rolling steadily down the main trail. The rumble fractured into distinct noises, the sharp clatter of wooden wagon wheels, missing their iron rims, the heavy, uncoordinated thud of hundreds of boot heels, striking gravel, the metallic clatter of lever-action rifles, slapping against leather saddles, and the low collective drone of angry voices fueled by cheap rye whiskey. The cowboy stood from the petrified stump. He reached down and unbuckled his heavy canvas duster, letting the sides hang open to expose the worn leather of his gun belt. He drew the Colt, checked the cylinder out of pure muscle memory, and let it slide smoothly back into the greased holster. He walked over to the roan, sliding a long, heavy-barreled Winchester repeating rifle from the saddle scabbard. He racked the lever. The action was butter-smooth, chambering a heavy brass cartridge with a solid, satisfying clack. He walked to the center of the yard, placing himself exactly midway between the repaired fence line and the heavy timber door of the shack. He planted his boots shoulder-width apart in the loose dirt. He rested the butt of the Winchester against his hip, his right hand gripping the stock, his index finger resting straight along the outside of the trigger guard. The vanguard of the mob crested the slight ridge marking the edge of the property. They spilled onto the flats a chaotic mass of denim-stained flannel and sweat-soaked wool. There were over 40 men. Some rode raw-boned trail horses. Others marched on foot, their faces flushed dark red from the heat and the liquor. They carried a haphazard arsenal of double-barreled coach guns, rusted hunting rifles, and heavy mining pickaxes. Miller led the center. The massive blacksmith sat astride a heavy draft horse holding a sawed-off 10-gauge shotgun resting across his thick thighs. Reverend Cale flanked him in the black buggy, his pristine wool coat now coated in a thick layer of white trail dust. The mob ground to a halt 20 yards from the fence line. The sheer weight of their numbers pressed against the suffocating silence of the desert. The horses shifted nervously, blowing wet foam from their nostrils, their hooves grinding the gravel into fine powder. Miller spat a thick stream of black tobacco juice into the dirt. He raised his heavy soot-stained hand, gesturing vaguely toward the shack. "Time's up, Drifter," Miller rumbled. The sound carried easily through the dry air. "Town voted. The rot ends today. Step aside, mount that roan, and keep riding. You stand there, you burn with the witch." The cowboy did not blink. His slate-gray eyes tracked the subtle movements within the crowd, the shifting of hands near trigger guards, the nervous darting of eyes, the tightening of jaws. He kept his gaze flat, his breathing slow and completely even. He did not say a word. "Stubborn fool," a voice rasped from the back of the crowd. A lanky man in a bowler hat raised a rusted Springfield rifle, bracing the heavy wooden stock against his shoulder. He closed his left eye, sighting down the long iron barrel, aiming directly at the center of the cowboy's chest. The cowboy's right hand moved. He did not draw the Colt. He whipped the Winchester up from his hip, leveling the barrel, cocking the hammer, and squeezing the trigger in one fluid, unbroken motion. The heavy rifle roared. A tongue of bright orange flame punched through the white glare of the sun. The concussive blast slapped against the eardrums of every man present. The man in the bowler hat jerked backward. The heavy lead slug caught him squarely in the right shoulder, spinning him violently off his feet. His Springfield discharged into the air, the stray bullet whining high over the tin roof of the shack. He hit the dirt with a heavy, unceremonious thud, a dark spray of blood misting the white dust behind him. For one fraction of a second, the mob froze, paralyzed by the deafening crack of the rifle and the brutal, instantaneous violence. Then the yard erupted. A chaotic volley of gunfire tore the air apart. deafening cracks of rifles mixed with the deep booming roars of shotguns. Lead slugs shredded the dry air, snapping past the cowboys' ears like angry hornets. Splinters exploded from the wooden fence posts. The ground around the cowboys' boots erupted in tiny geysers of pulverized dust and gravel as bullets hammered the earth. The cowboy dropped to one knee, letting a wave of buckshot sail through the space his chest had just occupied. The pellets shredded the skeletal mesquite tree behind him, raining dry leaves and bark onto his hat. He levered the Winchester, the empty brass casing spinning through the air, flashing gold in the sun, before hitting the dirt. He fired. Levered, fired, levered, fired. He didn't aim for the mass. He picked his targets with cold, mechanical precision. A man leveling a revolver dropped his weapon, clutching a shattered collarbone. Another man, taking aim from behind a wagon wheel, slumped forward, a neat hole punched through his Stetson. The thick, acrid smoke of black powder rolled over the yard, instantly choking the air, turning the blinding daylight into a stinging, sulphurous fog. Men shouted, their voices cracking through the haze. Horses whinnied in panic, rearing up and throwing their riders into the dirt. The cowboy's Winchester clicked dry. He dropped the long gun into the dirt. He stood up, stepping out of the thickest cloud of smoke, drawing the Colt revolver from his hip. A burly miner charged through the haze, swinging a heavy iron pickaxe aimed squarely at the cowboy's skull. The cowboy sidestepped the heavy, overcommitted swing, bringing the heavy blued barrel of the Colt down across the bridge of the miner's nose, the bone crushed with a wet snap. As the man fell, the cowboy fanned the hammer of the revolver twice, putting two heavy .45 caliber slugs through the chest of a gunman, rushing the left flank. Crack, crack. Heat flared along the cowboy's left side. A stray rifle bullet tore through the heavy canvas duster, slicing a shallow burning trench across his ribs. Warm blood immediately soaked into his flannel shirt, sticking to his skin. He did not flinch. He did not look at the wound. He pivoted his weight, tracking the source of the shot. Reverend Cale stood up in his buggy, a small silver-plated derringer trembling in his pristine hands. He fired the second barrel. The bullet struck the dirt 5 feet short. The cowboy raised the Colt, the front sight settling dead center on the preacher's black vest. Before he could pull the trigger, Miller's draft horse broke through the smoke. The giant blacksmith was a dozen feet away. His face twisted in a snarl of exertion, the twin black bores of his 10-gauge leveling directly at the cowboy's midsection. The cowboy shifted his aim. He cocked the hammer. He fired. The heavy slug struck Miller high in the chest. The impact threw the massive man backward, completely out of the saddle. His finger clamped down on the shotgun's triggers as he fell. Both barrels discharged simultaneously. A massive, deafening roar shook the earth. A wall of heavy lead pellets slammed into the rain barrel beside the shack. The thick oak staves obliterated, sending a torrential wave of cold water and jagged wood exploding across the porch. Miller hit the dirt hard, his heavy boots kicking up a cloud of dust. He rolled onto his back, gasping, his hands clutching the spreading dark stain on his shirt. He didn't move again. The booming echo of the 10-gauge rolled across the salt flats, hitting the distant canyon walls and returning as a low, hollow thunder. The cowboy stood in the center of the yard. The heavy Colt extended the barrel, smoking. Blood dripped steadily from his left side, pooling darkly in the alkaline dirt near the heel of his boot. He cocked the hammer back one more time. The sharp metallic clicks cut through the ringing silence. He waited. The thick veil of black powder smoke began to thin, pulled away by the desert wind. The mob was broken. The few men still standing stared at the bodies littering the yard, stared at the massive frame of Miller bleeding out in the dirt, and stared at the lone man standing perfectly still amidst the carnage. The liquor and the mob mentality evaporated, replaced by the stark, brutal reality of the blood soaking into the ground. A man near the back dropped his shotgun. He turned and ran. The panic was contagious. Men scrambled onto their horses, fighting over reins, whipping their mounts into a frantic gallop back down the trail toward Blackwood. Those on foot discarded their weapons, running blindly back into the shimmering heat haze, leaving their wounded groaning in the dirt. Even Reverend Cale had whipped his Morgan horse into a frenzy, his black buggy bouncing violently over the uneven terrain, desperate to escape the slaughter. The cowboy did not fire at their retreating backs. He kept the Colt raised until the last man disappeared into the blinding dust cloud. Only then did he slowly lower the weapon, letting his arm hang heavy at his side. The deafening roar of the gunfight faded, replaced once again by the vast absolute quiet of the open desert. The veil of black powder smoke thinned, carried off by the dry, relentless wind. The air tasted of scorched sulfur, pulverized dirt, and the heavy copper tang of spilled blood. The ragged breathing of the wounded men bleeding into the hardpan were the only sounds fracturing the returning silence of the salt flats. The cowboy stood perfectly still amidst the wreckage of the shattered fence. His own breathing was a slow, gravelly rasp beneath his dust-caked scruff. Dark red soaked the left side of his flannel shirt, matting the heavy fabric to his ribs. He did not press a hand to the wound. He simply flipped open the loading gate of his Colt, tipping the barrel upward. Empty brass casings tumbled out, clinking sharply against the blood-stained gravel. He reloaded the chambers by pure touch, snapped the cylinder shut, and slid the heavy iron deep into his greased leather holster. He bent down his joints, popping in the quiet heat, and retrieved his fallen Stetson. He slapped the brim against his thigh, knocking loose a thick cloud of white powder, and pulled it low over his slate-gray eyes. The heavy timber door of the shack creaked open. The girl stood on the splintered threshold. She looked at the bodies, the pooling blood, and finally at the tall figure in the torn canvas duster. He met her gaze. He gave a single slow nod. He turned his back, gathered the worn leather reins of his roan, and swung his heavy frame into the creaking saddle. He did not look back as he spurred the beast forward, his dark silhouette dissolving slowly into the blinding, white-hot distortion of the western horizon.